While we tend to define democracy in terms of procedures and values, we tend to define dictatorship as just the opposite of democracy. Dictatorships, or authoritarian systems, are countries that don't hold free and fair elections. It does, of course, get a little more complicated than that. And in this video, I will describe 4 different types of authoritarian government and discuss the role of elections under dictatorship. One of the defining characteristics of dictatorship today is not the absence of political institutions, but rather their presence. Over 80% of authoritarian regimes don't just hold elections today, but allow more than one party to compete in them. In 2010, only 5 countries had no legislature, and only 6 countries banned all parties. Dictatorships use democratic institutions to maintain themselves in power. But how do they do this? Some countries still obviously rig elections. These are cases where ballot boxes have been stuffed with fake ballots, citizens are paid or threatened to vote in certain ways, or authorities simply make up numbers of votes. For example, in Belarus's presidential election this year, poll workers described being pressured to sign off on paperwork that left the vote count blank, or they were counting votes for other candidates as votes for the incumbent president. This kind of fraud is very easy to detect. International and domestic election monitors in polling stations can often actually see them happening, and outside of that, statistics can detect anomalies in the numerical patterns that normal vote counts follow. So modern election rigging has become more sophisticated. Many authoritarian states shape the conditions under which elections take place in the months and years prior to a campaign, rather than stuff ballot boxes on election day. This is what Stephen Levitsky and Lucan Wei call creating an uneven playing field. Countries use state-owned media to vilify their political opponents. They make selective arrests of opposition leaders or party members to intimidate and incapacitate strong oppositions. They pack the judicial system with friendly judges who will turn a blind eye to corrupt practices. And they use the resources of the government, from control over public services to networks of allies and state-owned industries, to pressure voters to support the incumbent. This last part is called administrative pressure. For example, in Mexico before the year 2000, the ruling party, called the PRI, maintained power by using its control of radio and the dominant television network to give themselves sympathetic coverage and blacklist opponents. They used their control over business licenses to generate support from economic elites, and they used their control over public benefits to directly support areas of the country with higher vote totals for their party. The key factor here is the use of state institutions to influence election outcomes. Dictators do this to gain some degree of legitimacy from elections, and they also do it to co-opt some of their potential opponents by having them participate in an unfair game. So while the exact line between dictatorship and democracy is fiercely debated, if you do know a country is a dictatorship, generally it is going to be one of 4 types of systems. First are party-based dictatorships. During the Cold War, this was the most common type of dictatorship due to the prevalence of communist systems. Today, there are only 3 true communist political systems left in the world: China, Vietnam, and Cuba. But since they are really important, we still talk about single-party systems as a separate type. In these countries, there is only one legal political party, and that party chooses the country's leader from within their ranks. This is generally considered to be a pretty stable form of authoritarianism. Single-party states have clear procedures to handle the transfer of power between 2 officials, and they use the party to manage political participation. What you do is you encourage ambitious politicians to join the party and seek power within the system, rather than outside it. This is why they are also sometimes called bureaucratic authoritarian systems. That said, most of these systems collapsed in the early 1990s because they didn't actually do that. Statist economic policies failed to produce growth or quality of life on par with the West, and the party system itself failed to manage public dissent. Single-party states are not the only type of party-based dictatorship, however. As noted, most dictatorships hold elections, and most allow more than one political party to compete in them. These countries are called many names. Electoral authoritarian and competitive authoritarian are the most common ones. In these countries, a single party still wins all the elections, but the leader or ruling party will only take home 60 to 80% of the vote. The idea is that you're still managing relations among the elite. those with social or economic power, through a single party, but you're also able to co-opt some people who disagree with you into the system by allowing them to compete, albeit under unfair terms. This is also a pretty stable form of government. By co-opting potential challengers, these systems can effectively manage their oppositions, but party-based dictatorships can occasionally be prone to losing those elections and losing power with them. The second type of authoritarian regime is called a personalist dictatorship. These are also sometimes called sultanistic regimes. What they do is center decision-making in a single individual. Leaders manage their relationships with other elites and factions in the military through personal ties and patronage. This is offering jobs and money in exchange for support. The difference between this and a bureaucratic authoritarian or a party-based regime is that you aren't using political institutions to do this. You are managing things directly through individuals. Classic examples of personalist dictators include Saddam Hussein in Iraq and Idi Amin in Uganda. Even though these rulers may have had formal political institutions in their country, for example, Hussein ruled through the Ba'ath Party and Amin established military rule, all decisions are in fact concentrated in the hands of one person. It is kind of difficult to point to contemporary examples of personalist dictators. Some people say that Vladimir Putin in Russia or Xi Jinping in China are more personalist dictators rather than the heads of party-based regimes because they both change their country's rules to extend their time in power. A clearer example might be Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, who inherited his rule from his father and attempts to run the country through family and personal ties. These types of dictatorships tend to be very unstable. Because they do not institutionalize their rule, personalist regimes rarely survive more than one change of leader. The third type of regime is monarchy. Hereditary monarchies are rare in today's world, but they are remarkably durable. So here, just to be clear, we aren't talking about monarchies like the UK, where the Queen has very few formal powers. We're talking about monarchs that actually rule their countries. Examples do tend to be concentrated in the Middle East and include Saudi Arabia, Morocco, and some of the small Gulf states, like Qatar and Oman. These countries govern through traditional legitimacy and familial ties. Several of these countries have very small populations and lots of oil money, which makes it very easy to manage dissent through patronage. Other countries, like Morocco, appear to be gradually evolving into constitutional monarchies, where parliaments play an increasingly large role. What is most notable about these countries, though, is that they survive. During the region-wide pro-democracy protests of the Arab Spring in the early 2010s, most personalist regimes fell, but all of the monarchies in the region survived the threat of popular protest. Finally, there are military regimes, or juntas. These are countries where the military runs the political system, either directly or indirectly. Sometimes these regimes are run by a single person, as with Augusto Pinochet in Chile, and sometimes they are run by a junta, a council of military officers that share responsibility for governing, as with the junta that overthrew Isabel Perón in Argentina. Today, two examples of military regimes are Burma and Thailand. The military took power in Burma in a 1962 coup and has gradually allowed the reemergence of popularly elected officials. They held elections in 2015, and opposition leader Aung San Suu Kyi became prime minister the next year. Burma's constitution, however, allows the military to operate without civilian control, and they retain significant influence over the direction of the nation. Thailand is a different example. They have seesawed between democratically elected governments and military rule for the past 80 years. The most recent military coup was in 2014, when the military declared martial law after elected political parties had been unable to form a government or manage street protests. Thailand also has a hereditary monarch, and the protests that have been taking place there since July object to both the lack of democratic freedoms and the unusual behavior of the king. These are four general types of authoritarian regimes. As in countries like Thailand, actual regimes may be a combination of types and institutions. What they share in common, though, is rules and procedures that concentrate power in the hands of the few, with little accountability and few avenues to change the leadership through legal means. The definition of dictatorship.